The session 2 will be on South China Sea in Spotlight, 10-year recap. And we are pleased to have Ms. Cleo Paskal, Associate Fellow, Energy, Environment and Resources Department and Asia Pacific Program from Chatham House. And a gentle reminder again for the panelists and the moderator, there are only 12 minutes for your presentation. And I know it's hard for you to present the insightful analysis in only 12 minutes, but please be precise. And after the presentation, there will be 40 minutes for discussion and Q&A. So Ms. Cleo Paskal, you have the floor.
Thank you. Welcome back. I hope you had some coffee and ready for the next session. You will not be seeing me in every panel. This is the end of it. It's a great pleasure to be able to introduce the first panelist, Dr. Fang Zhang. We've been talking a lot about China, and I think we will really appreciate the point of view of somebody who knows a lot about Chinese strategy going out. So with no further ado, please. Thank you.
I think I have a slide to show. First of all, let me thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this high-level conference. I feel honored to be here. The question I'll try to address today is, over the past 10 years or so, has China developed a strategy in the South China Sea? If so, what is their strategy? And if not, why not? And I have set myself up as kind of contest with three influential views about what China has been doing in the South China Sea, its strategy. And I think you are all very familiar with those three views. The first view is to see China's strategy as a sort of an attempt at regional hegemony. And here is a quote from Admiral Harris in 2016. He said, "China seeks hegemony in East Asia." Simple as that. The second view, which is very influential in the think tank world, in the policy world, and this sees a sort of Chinese tactic that has been summarized as gray zone coercion. As the Pentagon puts it in its 2017 China military power report, gray zone coercion manifests itself as an optimistically timed progression of incremental but intensifying steps to attempt to increase effective control of disputed areas and avoid escalation to military conflict. And this view is gaining a lot of traction, especially in Washington, D.C. And the third point of view does not see a strategy or certainly not a grand strategy, but instead identify some pathologies in Chinese domestic policymaking, especially bureaucratic politics. And it posits that bureaucratic disorder and competition in the Chinese decision-making helps to explain policy contradictions. So this view sees lots of contradictions in Chinese policy rather than a coherent strategy. And my own argument, my own interpretation of Chinese policy over the past decade or so is that China does have a strategy, and there is an interesting history about this strategy. I think it is a strategy of balancing two sometimes contradictory goals. The first goal is to maintain regional stability. The second goal is to safeguard or enhance its rights in the South China Sea. So it has been a strategy of trying to achieve a difficult balancing act between those two goals. And it is not a strategy of regional hegemony or gray zone coercion. And there is an interesting history to it. I think the strategy has been implicit since the 1990s. And in July 2013, this is an important date because in that month, President Xi Jinping gave a speech on building China into a maritime power. In that speech, he articulated the central task of achieving a dynamic balance between rights and stability. But for the next 2 years, from 2014 to 15, the goal of that kind of balance was still eluded. And the main reason was, I think, some pathologies in domestic policy making, especially poor policy coordination. The best example of that is island building, which was an agenda of the PLA Navy. Then the next year, 2016, since the launch of a renewed effort at COC consultation, I believe Chinese policymakers has developed a more sophisticated understanding of the changing situation. And they, as a result, revised their strategic conception of their interests, evolving interests in the South China Sea, and strengthened domestic policy coordination. The result of that is a new, more sophisticated approach in trying to achieve some balance, and therefore we may argue, arguably, that it has achieved some success in the region since that year. I'm going to run through very quickly, because I have 6 minutes left, a series of major events since 2009 that have roiled the region and try to support my own interpretation of Chinese strategy during this period. First of all, from 2009-11, you see lots of news of Chinese assertiveness, mainly by the maritime actors. And here I think bureaucratic competition is a useful perspective. The Chinese also talk about the so-called nine dragons stirring up the sea. And then you have two events that also played a role. The Beijing Olympics in 2008 was a constraining influence. And then the expiry of the, in 2008, of the joint marine seismic undertaking agreement between China, the Philippines, and Vietnam was actually a catalyst to provocations from different sides. But even more important, I think, is a shift in intellectual and policy thinking among Chinese decision makers and analysts that this new thinking holds that for the roughly 10 years after signing the DOC in 2001, China has kept to the spirit of the DOC by exercising self-restraint, but this self-restraint was exploited by regional claimant states. So they argue that China needed to take a tougher and more assertive approach to the region. And I think it is this thinking, it is this changing thinking that led to different policies taken after 2009. In mid-2012, the government established a new leading small group for the protection of maritime rights and interests, and this has helped to consolidate decision making. And after that time, although the policy coordination was still a problem, it was not a huge problem afterwards. The second event I want to mention briefly is that, in fact, for the next 2 years, from 2011 to 2012, this was a period of moderation. Beijing clearly recognized that things were not going very well in the South China Sea, so they tried to inject an element of calm. You see State Councilor Dai Bingguo publishing a very important article, again arguing for peaceful development, and you see a series of measures taken by China with ASEAN countries trying to stabilize the situation. So they clearly recognize the importance of the goal of stability. So I would like to think that had it not been for the Scarborough Shoal incident of 2012, we might actually have had a more stable South China Sea than was in fact the case. And we recognize the significance of the Scarborough incident. And for China, and the significance was in finally promoting its strategic transition from previous largely sort of reactive mode of decision-making to a new approach of taking the initiative and shaping events in its favor. And equally important, I think, was the hint that this incident and its consequences given to the leadership that the main goal of Chinese strategy should be to achieve a balance between rights and stability. And this was what President Xi Jinping articulated in his July 2013 speech. But for the next 2 years, although the goal of balance was clearly articulated, it was not put to good implementation. And of course, here I'm referring to the island building enterprise that was begun from late 2013 onwards. And I regard this enterprise, as primarily something engineered by the PRIO Navy, which is a very significant domestic interest group. And the PRIO Navy, from their perspective, they may have thought that it was a good thing to do, and the timing was excellent. Here I have identified a few reasons for them to think so. First, the relationship with Philippines was going nowhere, and second, Manila's recourse to arbitration probably accelerated their timetable, and then you have the US rebalance, although certainly not a cause in itself, provided an ominous geopolitical pretext for taking the action. And you have some strategists who might have thought President Obama is indecisive and might, so that might be a good window of opportunity to do something drastic. But is island building evidence of China's hegemonic ambition? This is a very complex question, and I'd just like to briefly touch on 2 points. First of all, we need to isolate the PLA from other actors in the Chinese system. The PLA is a very important actor, but certainly does not constitute the whole of Chinese decision-making architect. And second point is that the PLA's desire to expand China's security perimeter reflects, I think, a strategy, the application of China's long-standing military strategy of active defense to the South China Sea. The purpose was to deter or counter US intervention in disputes there. And the challenge to US military dominance, which has been highlighted so strongly in so many writings, is, I think, a consequence of this active defense strategy, not a cause of it. I think it's important to make this clear. And then the latest development since 2016, the unleashing of COC negotiations was an attempt by Beijing, an proactive attempt by Beijing to turn changing circumstances in the first half of the 2016, the release of the arbitral ruling, to seize the negative occasion of the release of the ruling and turn it into a positive opportunity. That was a tactical approach. The Chinese decision makers believed that it would afford them some kind of silver lining, a bad situation, and it seeks to preserve stability by banishing the ruling and create a new diplomatic process. In a larger sense, it is an attempt to achieve a balance between stability and rights, and we see better coordination between the different policy actors in the Chinese decision-making system. So that was a tactical move with strategic significance. So my conclusion is that if we want to describe China's strategy, regional hegemony is still premature, and the evidence so far doesn't really support it if we look carefully at the evidence. And so the same, I think, is true for the characterization or the thesis of Gray's on coercion. I see the strategy as a dialectic and difficult one of balancing the goals of safeguarding rights and maintaining stability. These goals often come into conflict, which explains some confusions in what China has been doing. And because the goals sometimes come into conflict, the means can become confusing too, and you have different actors advocating different kinds of policies. So it has been a challenge. It has been a challenge for China to achieve that kind of balance. And the balance has proved to be elusive on many occasions over the past decade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zhang. That was very useful and gave us a lot to think about, nuanced and a lot of depth there. China's definitely not monolithic, and it helps to understand. I'm not giving everybody's biography because they're in the wonderfully presented book. The next speaker will be Mr. Cronin, who is with the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at CSIS, whose maps we've all used and are very grateful for. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My research focused on the U.S. perceptions of how we got to where we are today in the South China Sea. It basically covers key incidents during the Obama and Trump administrations, how the U.S. responded to them, and what that all means going forward. I don't have any insider knowledge since I was not a member of either administration, but hopefully that means that I can be fair and impartial to both of them. The longer paper that I wrote focuses on the differing messaging strategies of the administrations, but would take too long to dig into here, and cognizant of the timing, I will just focus on some of the major inflection points of the last 10 years, what we can glean from the two administrations from them, and where U.S. strategy could go from here. So, 2009, the first inflection point comes in May of 2009. It was China's note verbal response to the joint Vietnamese and Malaysian submission to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. Accompanying the note was the infamous 9-dash line map that you can see here. This marks the first time the 9-dash line entered the modern discourse. In the note, China claimed that it has indisputable sovereignty over the islands in the South China Sea and the adjacent waters, and enjoys sovereign rights and jurisdiction over the relevant waters. The U.S. had already recognized the growing soft power and economic influence of China in the region and around the world, but this note was a different story. While seizure of features like Johnson Reef and Mischief Reef in the 80s and 90s was threatening, this official diplomatic submission to the UN indicated much wider aims, that it seemed to say that China wanted not just a place at the South China Sea table, but dominion over it. The Obama administration outreach to Southeast Asia began shortly thereafter. In July, Secretary Clinton signed onto the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, a point that some see as the first step towards the pivot or rebalance to Asia. 2010 saw bold remarks from Secretary Clinton at the ARF. After private urging from ASEAN member states, Clinton stood up and identified the peaceful resolution of competing sovereignty claims in the South China Sea as a U.S. national interest, further calling for a collaborative diplomatic process by all claimants for resolving the various territorial disputes without coercion, and saying the U.S. opposes the use of force by any claimant. Especially since these comments came after ASEAN member states had spoken similarly on the subject, the message was seen as a pretty clear rebuff to Chinese attempts to dominate the discussion. 2011, the birth year of the rebalance or the pivot to Asia. In November, Secretary Clinton published her article, America's Pacific Century, in Foreign Policy magazine, which laid out the clear argument for a strategic, multi-pronged approach to the region. Around the same time, President Obama in Canberra announced the Darwin Troop Rotation Agreement, enhancing U.S. presence in the region, and also attended the 6th East Asia Summit, the first time that a U.S. president had attended that summit. In response, we saw a good deal more Chinese assertion in 2012, especially with the Scarborough Standoff in April. The standoff was the first indication of exactly how assertive China was willing to be in this era by sending PLA Navy ships against what was a U.S. treaty ally. The Obama administration was caught flat-footed by the crisis and was outmaneuvered by China, leading to China's present occupation of the reef just 120 nautical miles off of the Philippines. And we still see China's security presence there, usually 1 or 2 boats parked in the mouth of the shoal there and blocking entrance to it. I won't go into the 2012 ASEAN joint communique in detail, but Cambodia's willingness to buck ASEAN interests for the sake of Chinese interests highlighted China's undue pressure on politics in ASEAN and the helplessness of ASEAN's consensus-based process to handle such. While ASEAN centrality remains a touchstone of U.S. policy in the region, many in Washington have grown frustrated by the impossibilities of the consensus system. The Senkaku dispute is a little outside our purview of the South China Sea, but that flare-up in the East China Sea showed Chinese assertiveness extended beyond the South China Sea alone. In addition, the Senkaku and Scarborough conflicts occurring the same year cast a harsh light on the difference between the two mutual defense treaties and how the U.S. viewed its treaty obligations. Whatever the validity of the legal argument, observers in Manila were and still are upset that U.S. support appeared stronger for Japan than for the Philippines. The Philippines-China Arbitral Tribunal was filed in January 2013. The Philippines filing the case for arbitration under UNCLOS is somewhat emblematic of the Obama era in the South China Sea. The pursuit of a diplomatic and legal solution to disputes per international law and supporting allies in the region was eventually stymied by Chinese action on the ground and an inability to garner sufficient widespread international support. In late 2013, we also saw the very beginning of China's rapid land reclamation campaign. We at AMTI may be a little biased in thinking this, but I see the beginning of reclamation in the Spratleys as one of the key inflection points of this 10-year span. And the fact that the US was so slow to publicly challenge this major attempt to literally change the facts on the ground, or on the sea as it were, was a serious lost opportunity for a defense of the rules-based order. 2014 was an embodiment of the diverging strategies in the region. In the spring, a few months after the destruction caused by Typhoon Haiyan in the central Philippines, Ambassador Philip Goldberg signed the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement in Manila. With disaster response and preparedness as a driving factor, the EDCA underscored the benefits of U.S. involvement and assistance to the region. The fact that it would also allow pre-positioning of supplies and ready access to air bases near the Spratleys was a huge plus for supporters of U.S. involvement in the region. Unfortunately, implementation of EDCA has slowed to a crawl and has been hamstrung by the Duterte administration, so the hard work that went into negotiations hasn't yet paid off. Just a month later, we saw China deploy the Haisai 981 drilling rig to waters not too far east of here, south of Triton Island. I don't think that I need to explain the importance of that event to this audience here. That summer, China also attempted to block resupply to the Philippine Marines on the grounded Sierra Madre at Second Thomas Shoal. When the Philippines ran the blockade to deliver the supplies, there was the U.S. Navy P-8 overhead, watching the China Coast Guard's every move, sort of saying, hey, look out, the world has its eyes on you and we're watching what you're doing here. You can't really argue the counterfactual in this case, but I think that there's a good chance that without the visible presence of U.S. military observers, the Philippines might have had a much harder time maintaining that outpost. In 2015, at the Shangri-La Dialogue in June, Secretary Ash Carter, in addition to remarks calling for an immediate halt to reclamation, announced the $425 million Southeast Asia Maritime Security Initiative to bolster partner capacity. In September, FONOPS became a household word. David Shear of the Pentagon and Admiral Harry Harris of Pacific Command went to the Senate to discuss maritime security strategy in the Asia-Pacific. This was the first public discussion of the FON program, and Senator John McCain's persistent questioning on FONOPS around the reclaimed Spratleys set the tone for the FON program over the next few years. The meeting between President Obama and President Xi culminated in Xi's pledge in the Rose Garden not to militarize the islands in the South China Sea. Regardless of claims of dual use or defense only, since this statement, we've seen a wide array of weapons and jammers and military infrastructure deployed to the islands. We've seen aggressive confrontations over passages that are fully in compliance with international law, overflights challenged and harassed, dangerous encounters like the one with the USS Decatur about 6 weeks ago. It seems apparent that the Rose Garden Pledge was somewhat of a hollow one. The Us-Asean Summit at Sunnylands was seen as a real victory for the Obama administration. President Obama secured some of the strongest language on maritime disputes to date from ASEAN, but even so, you might note that nowhere in that statement does it specifically mention the South China Sea. That victory was overshadowed by other losses. The Arbitral Tribunal award came down on July 12th, and what should have been a resounding victory for the Philippines, thanks to Rodrigo Duterte taking office just 2 weeks earlier, did not end up being such a victory. Duterte wanted to make nice with Beijing and decided to sit on the award, and we've seen the ramifications of that. Duterte was, of course, not the only leadership change in 2016. Donald Trump's election in 2016 shook up U.S. foreign policy more than the election of any other candidate could have. His place as an untested outsider who rejected the many conservative foreign policy pros who had shunned him during the election meant no one could really predict where the U.S. might head on the South China Sea in the years to come. Meanwhile, the majority of the land reclamation activities in the Spratley Islands wrapped up, and China continued and still does continue building the outposts, but the actual dredging was done. One of the first decisions Trump made on taking office was to pull out of the TPP Accord the Obama administration spent years negotiating. The decision appeared to have more to do with domestic politics than with foreign policy, but the impact has been the same. The Trump administration did not speak much about the South China Sea in its early months, a move that some have tied to hopes of rapprochement with Beijing in order to cooperate on North Korean nuclear issues. New Defense Secretary Mattis also reverted the FONOP program to a routine Pentagon-driven process, regularizing the schedule of FONOPs and neglecting to publicize them as much as had been done during the Obama administration has brought the program back in line with the earlier conception as an unbiased, legally driven process, as opposed to its perception as a politically targeted program challenging China itself rather than its excessive claims. By the end of 2017, the temporary thaw with China seems to have ended. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, the Quad, was revived after years of dormancy. Like Japan, the Trump administration announced a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, right here in Da Nang, in fact. And in the National Security Strategy released in December, it rejected previous administrations' policies of engaging competitors and said that great power competition had returned, specifically calling out China and Russia as the other great powers. This year has seen continuation of that competitive edge. Look no further than the trade war tariff efforts. China was disinvited from the biennial RIMPAC exercises, specifically because of the militarization of the South China Sea. President Xi was reelected, ensuring continuity of his vision for China for the foreseeable future. And just last month, Vice President Mike Pence delivered what may turn out to be a key address on the Trump administration's feelings towards China. So, assessing the administrations. Early on, the Obama team saw the vaunted rise of China take a turn for the assertive. Their response was often indirect, not confrontational, and centered on diplomacy. They had a tendency towards what I'll call playing by the rules. Obama had faith in multilateral systems and regional architecture, saw a web of relationships under the Accord of International Law as the strongest, safest response to aggressive states. We see this in efforts like pursuing the TPP, joining the East Asia Summit, ASEAN and APEC summits, and supporting the Philippines arbitration. We also see it in at least the notion behind the pivot, embracing the region with a whole-of-government approach, uniting diplomatic, military, and economic efforts to draw in supporters and encourage rivals to get with the program. But it didn't play out as well as Obama's team had hoped. In many ways, ambitious plans were derailed by events going on elsewhere, like Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Ukraine, and Syria. Only one arm of the multi-pronged pivot approach, the military one, really followed through on the pivot plans, with the Darwin troop rotation, the Navy's ongoing rebalance of 60% of surface combatants to the Pacific, and for better or worse, the heightened publicity of US military forces engaged in FONOPs. But even the military prong suffered from missteps, and America's military might and credibility are now questioned by longtime allies like the Philippines. This, like many failures of the pivot, can be characterized by one of the greater flaws of the Obama administration, its unwillingness to take risks, especially when it came to disrupting the relationship with China. Knowing that their gray zone pushing the envelope tactics would not be challenged emboldened Beijing's worst instincts. It's a little harder to tease out a strategy for the Trump administration. I think this is partly because it's still in its early days. At this time in the Obama administration, the pivot announcement was still more than a year off, but also because strategic messaging has not been a priority for this administration. That's not to say that we haven't seen bold and clear messages come out at times, but they aren't part of a coordinated message. Whether this has to do with understaffed agencies or with Trump's preference to dominate issues personally rather than letting subordinates speak for him, or even President Trump's tendency to say nice things about leaders while pursuing strategies against them, I'm not sure. But we are certainly seeing some messaging on China and the South China Sea come out, so what can we discern from that? Between last year's national security strategy, the imposition of the tariffs in this year's trade war, and Vice President Pence's speech last month, we're seeing a team that is far more comfortable, has much more of an appetite for risk and confrontation than the last administration seemed to. Now, they benefit from starting the administration with a China that has already revealed its plans for the South China Sea, but I think even if the Obama team were starting in 2016 rather than in 2008, we wouldn't see the same confrontation. The rhetoric in the national security strategy was very America first, no surprise there, and talked about US military might and great power competition. But in reality, we're still seeing some solid cooperation with regional allies and security partners. It's good news to see a solid nominee to be ambassador to Australia finally, and I already touched a little bit on the rebirth of the Quad. Despite some complications in the relationship with Duterte, we still see mill-to-mill exercises continuing where Duterte had threatened to end them entirely. And Trump clearly listens to Japan well enough to adopt the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy framing. As Hong Le-Tu discussed in the earlier panel, free and open Indo-Pacific isn't really anything new. It's all about freedom, navigation, and open markets, which of course were priorities before, but renewed focus on the Indo part, and indeed even the rebranding of Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific, and that says promising things about US embrace of the region as a whole. In other ways, engagement with the region isn't so great. Trump surprised a lot of people by taking his tour of the region last year for the major summits in November, but it was still a big disappointment that he declined to come out this year. We'll see how that goes with Vice President Pence next week. Pulling out of TPP was a major own goal for relations with Southeast Asia, I feel. Trump has also fallen behind in inviting Southeast Asian leaders out to Washington. I believe there were 4 that came out last year, but we haven't seen any in this year. I don't think that Trump even called Prime Minister Mahathir back in May to congratulate him on his victory, just released a statement on it. So there's a lot of groundwork that he needs to do for relationships in the region. So we can clearly see some stark differences between the two: competition versus cooperation, multilateral versus bilateral, legalistic and diplomatic versus economic warfare. But despite the huge differences between the two men, there really is a common thread in their approach to the South China Sea, and I think the fact that 2 such different administrations have those in common shows that these interests are more general US ones, ones that extend beyond administrations. Freedom of navigation is essential to American interests, economically, militarily, for support of partners in the region, you name it. US power was built off of access to 2 major oceans, and the ability to project power throughout the world extends naturally from having access to the world's waterways. The rules-based order is of critical importance to both as well. Whatever Trump himself may think of international law, his administration values it and knows that the system built after World War II rewards those who play by the rules. The importance of the role the Indo-Pacific will play in this century, we already discussed a lot in the last panel, but demographics and economics make it impossible to ignore, and it's clear that the US interests are served by staying close to the Indo-Pacific and not being squeezed out. And ASEAN centrality was touched on as well. I know I said Trump himself hasn't done much to build relationships with ASEAN leaders, but the administration has been constant in underscoring the importance of the body in dealing with the South China Sea. So where does it go from here? The fate of the South China Sea is not set in stone. Things are certainly a lot more severe than they were 10 years ago, but I wouldn't say the world has lost its efforts to prevent Chinese dominance of the South China Sea. Preventing such dominance will take a concerted and coordinated effort, not just relying on FONOPs and trade wars, but a well-orchestrated whole-of-government approach that leverages allies and is also realistic in its goals. We're not going to wind back the clock or unbuild the artificial islands. Those are a done deal. But the Trump administration needs to sit back and envision what the South China Sea could look like 10 years from now. If it's not going to be a Chinese lake like some fear, what should it look like? And then working back from there to stake out the achievable steps that it'll take to get there. This conclusion is a little bit outside the scope of my research, but forgive me for trying to offer thoughts on how the administration might find a way to align common U.S. interests with its own priorities to find a way forward. In the short term, I think one of the key inflection points in coming years will be the COC negotiations. If COC comes through as a wishy-washy, non-binding agreement, it's no more powerful than the DOC and would be a wasted opportunity. Engaging with ASEAN nations on the COC process, informally, of course, outside of the actual negotiations, but assuring them that if they stand up for a fair agreement with China, they'll have the support of the US and other nations, will go a long way towards ensuring an actual fair code of conduct. Not one that solves the disputes, of course, but one that creates a South China Sea that all can utilize and access. Another measure to take care of immediately is assuring the Philippines the enduring support they have from the US under the Mutual Defense Treaty, including applicability of the MDT to the South China Sea. I'll skip through because I know I'm over time. Other things to focus on would be engaging other partners from the wider region, especially Quad nations and even further abroad, like the UK and France, to coordinate activities in the region, which may be FONOPs and transits and port visits, but more specifically underscoring the importance of international sea lanes to world economics and world commerce. The US also needs a response to the Belt and Road Initiative and the lure of Chinese infrastructure money. So far, all Washington has offered is some hand-waving and promises of being able to leverage private sector money. But as long as developing nations only have China to turn to in order to build their ports, railroads, whatever, they'll turn to China with good reason, and China's ability to pressure those nations or even swing deals like the Hambantota lease will grow. Admiral Philip Davidson, in his testimony before being made the new commander of Indo-PACOM, said, "China is now capable of controlling the South China Sea in all scenarios short of war with the United States." Speaking from his defense and military point of view, he's of course right. But capable of controlling doesn't mean it does control the South China Sea. And if the US pursues a concerted multilateral effort with its partners and allies in the region over the next 10 years, there's a fair shot of seeing an equitable modus vivendi, not a solved South China Sea, but a negotiated one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cronin. That's a very, very useful summary of how much has changed in the last 10 years, an indication of what might change in the future. And it's a good introduction to Dr. Tønnesson, who is with the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, and hopefully we'll get some insight into some conflict resolution for what might happen in the region as well. Thank you.
I have experienced the 10 years since the first conference held by the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam and the Vietnam Lawyers Association as a kind of constant crisis in the South China Sea. So I call it the 10-year crisis. This crisis is not, to a historian of the South China Sea, the first crisis, but it's the 8th crisis of a number of crises since 1909. The first of those crises I have studied as a historian working in French and British archives, but not in Chinese ones for lack of language competence. The crisis in 1973 to 75, which included the Chinese occupation by force of the southern Parasails from South Vietnam. I cannot remember because it drowned in the news from the Vietnam War at the time. But the crisis in 1988, I remember. The one that caused my interest in the South China Sea was the one that followed the Philippines' discovery of construction work going on in Mischief Reef in 1995. This led me to apply for support to a project which was carried out from 1998 to 2000 at the University of Oslo about the South China Sea conflict. At that time, I felt that this was very dramatic, and I needed to draw attention of the world to what could happen in the South China Sea. Others did the same thing. There was a British novel written about a war breaking out in the South China Sea. There was a James Bond film about war breaking out in the South China Sea. And Samuel Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations, also included a whole subchapter about the Third World War breaking out in the South China Sea. But I've actually discovered since that that period was not at all as serious a crisis as the crisis we've had since 2009. The 1990s was generally a constructive period where China pursued a policy of good neighborliness and tried to stimulate ASEAN, did not in any way oppose Vietnam joining ASEAN, and also it led to the declaration on the conduct of parties in 2002. After that declaration, everything turned very calm. When I met people and I told them that I had been working on the South China Sea, people well known, who were well informed about international relations, did not even know the names Spratley or Parasail or Scarborough Shoal. They'd never heard of it. So what was it that happened in 2009? We've already heard from Fang Zhang about some of the changes. The Beijing Olympics played a role. They can have had a constraining role until they had been held, but with the pride that it created in China, it also created a kind of new mood in China, a new mood characterized by suddenly discovering how important China had become and how strong China had become because of the phenomenal growth in its economy since it had joined the World Trade Organization. And this was further very much stimulated by the financial crisis in the West, because it struck the West, and it did not so much strike development nations and not China, and China was able to put a huge stimulus package into its economy so it could overcome it. More pride. And then this also stimulated concern in the United States, and particularly concern after President Obama was not very well treated during his visit to China in November 2009. I think these were some of the factors, but for the South China Sea specifically, it had to do with the Malaysian, Vietnamese calculations for the extension of their continental shelf sent to the United Nations, which caused protests both from the Philippines and from China, and a row of protests, and the introduction of the U-shaped line map to the world scene as a formal document sent to the United Nations. Now, in that crisis over the last 10 years, I see 10 major aspects of it, or changes. And the first is simply that you have seen tremendous growth in China's naval and military power, with land-based, precision-guided missiles, with submarines, with an enormous fleet of ocean-going ships, and with aircraft. So China has pushed its position forward militarily, at the same time as its economic presence in the region through trade, investments, aid has also increased. This is the big game changer. This has then also, as a second aspect of the crisis, been characterized in the militarizations of the features in the South China Sea. Not only the Chinese one, but the Chinese constructions, and notably the constructions of the 7 islands built in the Spratleys, have been the driving force here. But the third thing, there has been much tension, but no war. Actually, no direct military clashes. Behind this, I see perhaps not a strategy, but a Chinese tactic that aims all the time to push its position forward without risking a direct military confrontation. So in that sense, it has been important that China has also invested so much in its Coast Guard or maritime surveillance vessels, the white-hulled ships that are modern, well-armed, but not military, and also that there is a use of fishing vessels that are armed and with crews actually trained also in militia work. This is something, by the way, that Vietnam is also doing. The fourth aspect is growing Sino-US rivalry, and this has manifested itself both in surveillance activities that China tried to prevent and in these freedom of navigation operations. But the last one we saw in October seemed to be really dangerous in that the Chinese ship came into such close proximity to the USS Decatur, they say 41 meters. The external engagement of other countries has also grown. India, Japan, supporting the Philippines, Vietnam, getting closer to Vietnam and the Philippines, and also a growing European interest. Although I would say that perhaps the main European role has been in taking interest in the legal aspects, the international law aspect. The Arbitral Tribunal set up at the request of the Philippines had 4 European judges and 1 from Ghana and from Central European countries. So the sixth aspect of the crisis is what I would call legal polarization. Before the Arbitral Tribunal, or before this crisis, there were different legal opinions on various aspects, but with the Arbitral Tribunal and a growing convergence among the ASEAN claimants around certain views, we have got two standpoints in the legal debate. And these concern three main issues. The first is, can you have archipelagic baselines? Can you consider the island groups in the South China Sea as archipelagos with rights as such? This is the Chinese view. They say yes, and the Arbitral Tribunal says absolutely no, and the consensus among experts on legal experts on international law is no. The second one is the interpretation of UNCLOS 1213, where China and Taiwan hold that islands in the Spratleys can generate a claim to an EEZ of their own, while the Arbitral Tribunal said that none of them can. And this is also the view of the ASEAN claimants. At an earlier stage, this was not their conviction, but as the prospect of Chinese control of the area has grown, they have changed their view to the extent that they thought that their own occupied islands could generate an EEZ in the past. And the third aspect of this polarization concerns historical rights, where China holds that it can have historical rights within something called relevant waters, which probably converges with the U-shaped line, whereas this has also been totally refuted both by the Arbitral Tribunal and also by experts who have been invited to China's own conferences and who know about the role of historical rights in the international law. So basically you have got a polarization in the region which now makes it very difficult to reconcile the sides around on the basis of international law, although both China and the ASEAN claimants say that they want to do so. There has been division of ASEAN. Very often Cambodia is blamed for this, and it's said that Cambodia is capitulationist, as a recent article said, and also that it has been bought by China. I would say that Cambodia's point of view or posture is quite logical from its own position. If you look at its geopolitical position, squeezed between Thailand and Vietnam, it has similar interests in the sea as China. So I think any government in Cambodia would take up a position similar to what the Hun Sen government has done. So the division in ASEAN between those countries that are directly interested in the dispute in the South China Sea and those that are not is quite logical from a national interest point of view. The effect of the disputes is that you cannot do oil exploration in almost any area except those that are near the coast. The story of the tension and the incident stops oil exploration each time it happens. Companies that sign concessions don't really explore for oil because it's costly and you have a very long time perspective in oil exploration. And then the worst, almost the worst tragedy of the whole thing is this depletion of fish. The total biomass in the South China Sea is very likely to have decreased by something like 70 to 90%. This is also the case in other areas like offshore Myanmar, where we know much more about it. But this is the big tragedy in the South China Sea, which the dispute makes it difficult to do anything about. Then there is one positive thing, which is that we are here, and that there has been a tremendous growth in science and research about the South China Sea. This has also led to proposals for how to do something about the crisis, end it through cooperation. There was a recent publication last month from the Center for Strategy and International Studies in Washington, D.C., where they have assembled a group of 26 international experts who have come up with a really thought-through proposal, a blueprint, as they call it, blueprint for joint research, blueprint for exploration for oil and gas, and a blueprint for how to protect the environment and save the fisheries. This blueprint has inspired me to do something that is slightly different from what the CSIS does, and that is to set up a proposal for a 7-step process that now could be undertaken in order to overcome the crisis and generate cooperation, particularly around joint fisheries management. The difference between the CSIS proposal and mine is that they want all the countries to accept that the coastal state has prime responsibility for the activities within a zone that more or less conforms to what their EEZ would look like. I think this is a good idea, but I think it would be very difficult to get China to accept it with its historical right doctrine. What I suggest instead is to start in the small. Start with the disputed territorial seas of the disputed features, and start at Scarborough Shoal. The best thing China could do now is not to start having joint exploration of oil and gas on Reed Bank without recognizing it as the Philippines continental shelf. The best thing China could do would be to agree with the Philippines on setting up a joint management zone for fisheries in just the 12 nautical mile territorial sea of Scarborough Shoal. This would also include a kind of guarantee against any island building there or any militarization of Scarborough Shoal. And such a zone where Vietnam and Taiwan could be invited in, since they have recognized traditional fishing also at Scarborough Shoal, could form the model for what you could later do in the Spratleys and also in the Parasails, if China could recognize that Vietnam also has traditional fishing rights around the Parasails. I've stopped there. My time, I have gone 2 minutes over the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Tønnesson, for bringing in something that's the fisheries issue is something that extends all the way through the Pacific and is a very critical one that has the fish flashpoint potential. So thank you very much for bringing that up. We now have Dr. Sun, who's head of the Institute for South China Sea at the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, one of the organizers of this very important conference. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I was given the topic of speaking about ASEAN's perceptions and policy changes on the South China Sea over the past 10 years. But why ASEAN? Why does ASEAN matter? It's an age of the Quad, it's an age of the major powers plays. Why should we listen to ASEAN? Well, the reason why ASEAN is important because it's the residents in the region, and because it is the residents, it gives legitimacy for anyone who wants to do something about the region. So that's why everybody has been scrutinizing on what ASEAN has been saying about the South China Sea, and whether or not in its annual joint communique, the South China Sea is reflected properly in the joint statement. Whenever ASEAN says it is concerned about the South China Sea, or there is a problem in the South China Sea, there's a pretext there for any countries to do some activities on it. Whereas if ASEAN keep quiet about it, then China can say there's no problem, so what are you doing here? That's why ASEAN is important. Then ASEAN, because of that, ASEAN has been a subject of heavy criticism so far whenever it comes to the South China Sea. Most of the criticism has been saying that ASEAN is ineffective, ASEAN's cannot solve or manage the problem properly. And the criticism goes to the point that, there's a call for counting out ASEAN when it comes to the South China Sea. And it no longer is a viable player on the issue. Well, I would like to defend ASEAN by counter-criticizing those criticisms that they fail to recognize the nuanced changes in ASEAN's perception and positions on the South China Sea. And they failed also to recognize the sheer size of the problem that ASEAN has had to face, the growing size of the problem ASEAN has had to face. So, what happened to ASEAN then over the past 10 years? Going back to 2009, it's worth taking Stein's observation that the name Spratley in South China Sea didn't even exist among the ASEAN official circles back then. The South China Sea issue was almost like a taboo within ASEAN back in 2009. Why was it so? the signing of the Declaration of Conduct on the South China Sea somehow gave ASEAN the illusion that the South China Sea issue was contained. And ASEAN somehow wanted to avoid discussion on the South China Sea since then. Back then, the South China Sea issue was perceived as mostly a territorial dispute that only involves a number of its members, 4 of its members to be precise, and ASEAN as a group didn't want to deal with it. A subset group of the claimants was created in ASEAN. Whenever there's something to talk about the South China Sea, it's usually given to the group of claimants first, and then ASEAN was going to just endorse or whatever the claimants could agree upon. And then whenever ASEAN meets as a group, they try to not discuss the South China Sea issue. South China Sea related matters are only discussed or touched upon under the disguise of regional and international developments. Discussions direct to the South China Sea issue only appeared on the discussion of the DOC implementation. There, only the cooperative aspects of the South China Sea is discussed, and the security aspect of the South China Sea is not discussed. So that's how ASEAN was back in 2009. But something happened in 2009 that changed everything. Yes, the official enunciation of the 9-dash line got every countries in the region off guard. Certainly, countries like Singapore, Indonesia started questioning, what about UNCLOS? What about the rule of law? And then, among the claimants, there are at least 2 other countries got interested in the South China Sea. With 6 countries, at least in the ASEAN 10, interested in the South China Sea, consensus on the issue was easier to build. And then there's not only just the issue of the 9-dash line. As Stein also correctly pointed out, China started to behave differently after the financial crisis. It started thinking that that's game over for the United States. Its time had come, and the idea of a G2 in the Pacific started to come up. And US, of course, was alarmed by that, and when it announced in Phuket that United States is back in Southeast Asia, ASEAN started realizing maybe the South China Sea was not just about the disputes, maybe it's about something else as well. The US is coming back to Southeast Asia, not just for ASEAN, it was also coming back for China as well. That's why ASEAN started to have a different perception on the issue of the South China Sea. Not only it is a territorial dispute, it's also about the rule of law, it's also about geopolitical play. That's why when in 2010, Vietnam was the chair of ASEAN, we proposed the re-inclusion of the South China Sea formally under the ASEAN agenda. It was easily accepted. Also on that same year, Vietnam proposed the admission of the United States and Russia into the East Asia Summit. A decision was made to agree on those admission, although the first participation of US and Russia onto the East Asia Summit didn't take place until 2011 under Indonesia chairmanship. Now, in 2011, under Indonesia chairmanship, there was a significant development. A guideline on the implementation of the DFC was signed. ASEAN was able to overcome difficulties that it had before during the 9 years negotiation on the guideline. That was a point when China consistently rejected. It tried not to recognize ASEAN's common practice of meeting among itself before meeting with China. That's why the guideline never come into existence. But ASEAN at that point in 2011 agreed to remove that requirement by China, but to agree on another point that ASEAN was going to formally discuss the DOC implementation and report it to the foreign ministers whenever it meets with the Chinese. So ASEAN was still hoping that the implementation of the DOC could help calm down the situation on the South China Sea. Philippines back then had a different idea. It didn't think that the DOC was going to help. That's why it came up with the idea of a zone of peace, friendship, and cooperation, the ZOFIC, which main idea was to segregate the disputed area from the undisputed one, and then to proceed with cooperation only in the actual disputed area defined by UNCLOS. Now, 2012, there is a famous inability of ASEAN to join, to issue the joint communique. Now, that failure actually helped ASEAN in many ways. It was an awakening call for ASEAN, of course, on the safeguarded principle of consensus and how that cherished asset of ASEAN was actually exploited by a major power to its advantage. But it also allowed ASEAN to enact a champion within ASEAN to guide ASEAN through the difficulties when the chairman of ASEAN on that year faced serious difficulties. It also initiated, for the first time, serious discussion on the consensus principle within ASEAN, and the subsequent issuance of the 6-point declaration on the South China Sea, championed by Indonesia, actually served as a new elevated lowest common denominator in ASEAN on the matter, a fallback position for ASEAN whenever it faced difficulties on the South China Sea issue. It also helped new or later chairmen of ASEAN to get prepared to better handle the South China Sea issue when its chairmanship comes. And Brunei did just that. As soon as it took over the chairmanship from Cambodia, it proactively approached US, China, and in those high-level visits that the Sultan of Brunei took to US and China, early in its chairmanship, the South China Sea issue was prominently and centered on the agenda. So no longer ASEAN is avoiding the issue, but it's taking the South China Sea right and center in its agenda. In 2014, Myanmar was the chair of ASEAN. Everybody thought that Myanmar, which has the least to do with the South China Sea issue and who has the closest relationship with Beijing, could likewise collapse under Beijing pressures when it handles the South China Sea. But to everyone's surprise, Myanmar was surprisingly well prepared. And when the oil rig incidents came out in 2014, and the oil rig place was carefully calculated in order to make it look like a bilateral issue between Vietnam and China, because the location where it was sent to is the Parasail, and the Parasail, we all know ASEAN has always avoided discussing in the past. But just a week after the oil rig incident, the oil rig was sent to Vietnam. Under Myanmar's chairmanship, ASEAN was able to issue a standalone statement on the South China Sea, a staunch criticism on China, and marked the first time ASEAN was responding to an incident in the Parasail. 2015, Malaysia had to face the challenge of responding to the escalating land reclamation China had been taking on in the Spratlys. So Malaysia, given its practice of quiet diplomacy, it didn't make the issue too much out to the public, but strategically, Malaysia was quietly pushing for an elevated ASEAN-US partnership. And on that same year, Malaysia was able to secure a signing of a strategic partnership between ASEAN and the US. Laos, in 2016, had to face the reality that the tribunal ruling was coming out. And so Laos had to deal with the question of how ASEAN should be handling, or what ASEAN should be saying when the ruling came out. So in the Laos statement, although ASEAN avoided making direct comment on the tribunal ruling, it made a reference, and very high on the joint communique, that ASEAN should be fully respectful to the legal and diplomatic processes, an indirect way of referring to the tribunal ruling and the litigation process, in a way of supporting the tribunal ruling. It also undertook the first ever US-ASEAN Summit outside of ASEAN territories in the US territory at Sunnyland. So in subsequent years, ASEAN was able to unite to actually promote cooperation with dialogue partners in a way it was not able to do before. ASEAN agreed, like you recently heard, to conduct the first ever joint military exercise with the US. And this has gone very much beyond ASEAN's self-imposed restraint of getting closer with dialogue partners in defense cooperation for fear of sending the wrong signals that it is militarily aligned among themselves or with dialogue partners. So, in a conclusion, ASEAN's response to the South China Sea over the past 10 years have actually gone a lot more matured. It has been able to do so because the size of the problem has increased, but ASEAN has also learned how to build consensus among itself on a broader perspective of the South China Sea, and not just merely the territorial aspect of it. In my opinion, ASEAN is going to be helped by actually segregating the South China Sea issue into its smaller components and seek the consensus or the common views of its members on that smaller components of the South China Sea issue. For example, ASEAN can have a talk merely on the territorial disputes of the South China Sea and maybe can agree to a non-aggression pact, an idea that has been proposed in ASEAN before. Or ASEAN has been talking about its common outlook on the Indo-Pacific strategy, and I understand that consensus is building on such an outlook to be released next year. I strongly believe that partial consensus on the parts is better than having no consensus on the whole, and that is what ASEAN is going to be helped on the time to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, it's certainly a lot to think about, covering the major changes of the last 10 years, including domestic power balance in China and legal issues, fisheries, US leadership, ASEAN, the physical environment. So so we have 20 minutes for discussion, and looking forward to your questions. Who's going to volunteer? Lordship?
She didn't see me. Can I speak now?
Thank you very much. I'm not expressing any opinions, but I would like to point out one legal technicality that has been overlooked in the debate in the South China Sea that may have very far-reaching implications. I have to warn you that you have to be aware of this. That is the notion of freedom navigation. Because now in the Royal Sea Tribunal, there is a pending case between Panama and Italy. The focus is on the meaning of freedom navigation. In the context of the South China Sea, we have heard so many expressions regarding the freedom navigation challenges by etc. etc. But you see, in the Royal Sea, freedom navigation is a special term under the 1982 Royal Sea Conventions. Any state have freedom navigation in the high seas or the exclusive economic zone. The problem with the South China Sea debate is that no state has ever clarified when they invoke the so-called freedom navigation, whether they regard the seas questions as the high seas or the territorial or the exclusive economic zones. You see, you look at the South China Sea arbitration between the Philippines and China, which is not permanent court arbitration award as generally understood is the Annex 7 of the 1982 Royal Sea Convention award, but the arbitrators happen to be using the facilities at the permanent court. That's all. Okay, my point is that you look at the debate. Are we saying that the fisheries in the South China Sea are entitled to exclusive economic zone? All of them, because they have been keeping saying freedom navigation, freedom navigation. If some of them are, the others are not, but you still say freedom navigation. So in territorial sea, you have the right of innocent passage, right? So the regime has to be distinguished. It's very important because now, at the time of conclusion of the finalized court conduct, if this word comes up, it has very, very strong implications that now you are expressly acquiesced or being stopped from denying the features, some or all of them, of having the right to generate 200 miles. So my point is you have to be aware, maybe a way out from a lawyer perspective is to use the neutral word, for example, the rights of navigational passage, something like that, and with a footnote that this wording includes where applicable freedom navigation on the high sea, freedom navigation in the exclusive economic zone, the right of innocent passage in territorial sea, where applicable, something like that. This is something that I would strongly recommend you to have a closer look at it, because we spend so much time in the debates by, the arguments by Panama, Italy, on the meaning of freedom navigation. The judgment will come out in the spring next year. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very useful comment. And just, I'll take a bunch of questions, but before, does anybody want to respond to that particular issue on freedom of navigation terminology? Okay. All right, so we'll take 3 or 4 questions and then we'll go around. Yes.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Puso Terak. I'm from Cambodia. I would like to make a comment, and I have 2 questions for the first 2 speakers. I'd like to begin by expressing my appreciation to Dr. Stein Tønnesson. I hope I pronounce your name correctly. And of course, Dr. Sung, my good friend, for giving justice to Cambodia with regard to the failure of non-issuance of the so-called joint communique sent 2012. These incidents still haunted Cambodia in a big way, but I really appreciate your view from Dr. Tønnesson. You said that it is a logical way that a small state would do, and my good friend Song also talked about it's because of this so-called incident. ASEAN is more focused on how we forge consensus on extreme sensitive matter. But I like to add for some clarity, but because maybe a party most directly concerned here is Cambodia, to mention there was 3 options during the time for all ASEAN to take into consideration. The first was to issue the normal expressions of concern in the South China Sea. The second option is to perhaps add a strong wording like express grave concern, of which you see later on ASEAN did that. And the third option was on the table for discussion was that to refer to Spratley and Parasail as suggested by member state. You know who they are. I don't want to name those countries. And this is a sticky point, and that's why Cambodians take a position that if you add specifically reference like geographic scope, and now you see it's the same problem happened in the COC. Cambodia would not support such things. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody at this conference know the inside or closed door discussions during that time, so that we don't jump into conclusions that Cambodia is a spoiler. And another thing is that I invite all of you to also analyze very, very strongly the push factor from China when it comes to their core interests. Cambodia's a small state, but you have to see a bigger state, what bigger state is doing. So that's my point. Now let me ask a question. Sorry, I make it too long. Dr. Fang Zhang, and I really appreciate your view about China try to balance between right and stability, try to ensure their right or core interest is at stake, at the same time maintaining stability. Let me ask you a question. Do you see personally China as an aggressor in the South China Sea or as a broker for peace and stability in the South China Sea? Please be very specific. My question to our friend from United States, Mr. Conor, can you comment? I really appreciate your view about the U.S. strategy in the South China Sea from Obama to Mr. Trump. But can you say something about the often cited comment by China that no third party involved in the South China Sea. How would you want to respond to China on these issues? How is the U.S. View? And I think the judge have mentioned about this freedom of navigation just now. And may I push a bit further? If and when a conflicts happen in the South China Sea between claimant state, what would the U.S. prepare to do? Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Yes, Carl Thayer from the University of New South Wales. I'd like to address mine to Fang Zhang. And it's to challenge your assertion that China isn't seeking regional hegemony in 3 sub-questions. The Scarborough Shoal incident of 2012 saw Kurt Campbell and Madame Fu Ying negotiate a withdrawal of ships on both sides. China didn't leave, and the orders were countermanded from PLA headquarters. They weren't going to give up Scarborough Shoal. 2, the Haiyang Shiyo 981 incident of 2014. It followed guidelines with Vietnam on how to manage maritime disputes, a beautiful visit by Premier Ly Keqiang when relations were at an all-time high, no action by Vietnam, but yet this massive rig and an armada of 80 to 100 ships put in Vietnam's exclusive economic zones. Why? And third, in the single draft negotiating text, 2 areas show, to me, Chinese hegemony. No one's allowed to have military exercises unless they notify anybody else and see if there are objections, so China has a veto. And all natural resources in the region can only be shared between Chinese and Southeast Asian countries. Now, why are those clauses in there, and why are third parties excluded, the dialogue partners, from supporting the code of conduct? It seems to me China is carving out space in all 3 examples that it determines the order and not anybody else. Thank you.
Thank you. One last quick question.
Robert Beckman, National University of Singapore. Just a question for Zhang Feng. You talked about China wanting to assert its or protect its rights, but you didn't explain what they meant by rights. Is it rights to resources, and what's the legal basis for that? And where?
Okay, thank you. So due to time constraints, there's about 10 minutes left, so we're going to go through the panel, and everybody will have just over 2 minutes to answer these very complex and important questions. We'll start in the order of the presentations, if that's okay. Are you ready? Okay.
Thank you. I can never be ready for these questions, but I'll try my best. First question on whether I think China is an aggressor or stabilizer in the South China Sea. This puts me in a very difficult position. I think, as you know, as in all academic discourse, we ought to put definitions on these terms, but I think it would be safer to say that China has been expanding over the past decade or so, expanding in the South China Sea according to its own conception of its interests in the region. And whether it has been aggressive or stabilized, I think that will require more fine-tuned analysis. I hope I would be able to do that in the future. Second question, Carl, thank you very much for 3 quick-firing questions, challenging my account. And first on the Scarborough Shoal, I think one point I want to make about this incident, that this incident lasted for 2 months. And Chinese thinking during the first month and during the second month actually were different. And it was only in the second month that China decided to seize control of the shoal. So it is, I think, this evolution of thinking and policy that deserves more attention than it has so far being received. And I didn't quite get your third question, but I suppose the point is that China wants to carve out the South China Sea its own sphere of influence by imposing its own rules and norms in the region. Is that the? I suppose that is a point you are making. And if this is in reference to its negotiation over the COC with ASEAN countries, I think at the moment this is, I would see it as a bargaining tactic. And there's a lot of bargaining to do over the course of COC negotiations in the next few years. Finally, what rights, Professor Beckham's question, what rights China was talking about, broadly speaking, territorial sovereignty and maritime rights. But of course, this immediately raises the question of what China means by sovereignty and maritime rights in the South China Sea. And we all know that there's a fair bit of ambiguity in Chinese claims, and this is a very old question, at least as old as since 2009 when China put up the U-shaped line, which raised alarms in the region, throughout the region. I would just like to make one point. Legal ambiguity, I think, is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it raises outside apprehensions about Chinese ambition and can be an impediment to better policymaking. On the other hand, ambiguity does confer advantages, tactical or strategic, under certain conditions. You certainly wouldn't want China to solidify the position that it wants all of, say, whatever it is claimed within the U-shaped line, right? So China has not said that. So it is an interesting question. The advantages and disadvantages of such ambiguity, I think we need to take account of both.
Thank you. Quickly, I'd just like to thank His Lordship for bringing up the excellent point about the need to be specific with the legal distinctions of what freedom of navigation really means and the importance of laying out the specifics of it. One of the things I explore in my paper is talking about the October 2015 freedom of navigation operation by the Us-Asean and just what a messaging disaster it was because of how the Pentagon tried to follow up with the reasons behind the operation that they undertook there, and how the challenges that they were making by doing an innocent passage past Subi Reef when they were first put out there seems to imply a recognition of China's territorial claims. And so with a lack of specificity on the legal distinctions of freedom of navigation, they created more of a headache for themselves than they had anticipated. So yes, I agree entirely that it's very important to approach these from a legal perspective and being sure of specifically what aspects of the law you're talking about. On the questions from my Cambodian friend, I think that you have a great point about Cambodia as a small state, and I tried to take pains in my remarks not to castigate Cambodia for going along with China. I think that China, clearly it was about China's influence on ASEAN rather than Cambodia's going along with ASEAN. Your question was about third-party involvement and if there's a conflict, what might the U.S. do? I can only hazard a guess at it, but I think it depends first and foremost what you mean by third-party involvement, and involvement can be a very ambiguous term. I don't think the U.S. wants to force its way into the South China Sea by any means, but if involvement means coming in when parties in the South China Sea want the U.S. involved there, such as a treaty ally or someone like Vietnam, a security partner, something like that, I think that it should be allowed for the U.S. to come to the consultative aid or whatever other kind of aid that their partners are asking for without China having a veto over that.
3 points. First, His Lordship Kriangsak Chaisari talked about the undefined character of the South China Sea when it comes to maritime boundaries. So we don't know what is EEZs. And that distorts a question about freedom of navigation. I think this underlines the importance of aiming for maritime delimitation. When you have a system of clear zones and boundaries, problems are easier to tackle. Try to imagine that China was having a naval exercise, perhaps together with Russia, perhaps alone. Just before this exercise happened, the United States announced that it would carry out missile tests in an area overlapping with the zone where China was carrying out its exercise. And this would be in kind of disputed area. How would China react? This scenario is exactly what happened 2 weeks ago outside the Norwegian coast, when NATO was having a big exercise, and then Russia comes in and tells that it will carry out an exercise with missile tests overlapping with the zone of the NATO exercise. It did not cause more than anger and some friction, because we know the exact coordinates, we are used to each other, to how to avoid direct incidents. So it was just for NATO to avoid operating in the areas where we knew the missiles would come. My second point is that I attended the Changshan Forum recently in Beijing, organized by the People's Liberation Army, or the Military Academy. And my impression there was somewhat different from the impression I've had at earlier forums. This time, the tone was very critical of the United States, but extremely forthcoming towards the rest of the world. Because China seems to see a need now to get friendly with others in order to ward off what they see as an unpredictable and mounting threat from the United States, linked to the trade war and to the Trump personality. This could give ASEAN and other countries a chance to approach China with proposals for measures that could improve relations, and not to repeat the mistake that was done after the DOC in 2002 and let things just calm down. A diplomatic offensive. And Vietnam has a greater chance to do this now that it has a unified leadership that can directly meet the one who takes decisions in the United States, in China. Because that's a big change in China. In the past there was collective decision making, now there's one man taking the decisions. Try to build up an agenda for Chong to bring to the table with Xi Jinping that aims at some feasible measures like the one I suggested in my 7-step proposal, and concentrate it on fish.
Well, I'm going to make a brief comment on freedom navigation regime. Whereas it is expected that ASEAN member states are going to have different views or different interpretation on the regime, what ASEAN collectively can do is to provide transparency in the process of interpreting the legality aspect of it. And that's, I believe, was precisely what ASEAN was trying to do at the recent defense ministers meeting, when it questioned the US and China on their understanding of the freedom of navigation rights, and why that such incidents still almost happen despite the two countries signing the Qs. So transparency is a service that ASEAN can provide to everyone to the advantage of all. Secondly, on the code of conduct, which Professor Thayer mentioned, I don't see how ASEAN could agree to those demands by China to close off the South China Sea for cooperation with other countries, whether on the oil aspect or on other aspects. China has been trying to use the COC as another charm offensive towards ASEAN, but the revealing of its intention is not going to help. So I don't see what is China trying to achieve by making those demands on ASEAN.
All right, well, I'm not going to stand between you and lunch. This is a lot to think about and digest. This is the last 10 years, and maybe over lunch we can talk about the next 10 years. And when you have your 20th conference, what we'll be talking about then, looking backwards. So I'd just like to thank the panelists, the organizers, and the translators in the back for helping us move forward on this. Thanks.